It began not in the 19th century, but in the quiet corridors of a Massachusetts auction house in 1979. Among the worn furniture and cracked glass frames, a single photograph drew the attention of a collector named Harold Vance. It showed a Victorian family of 5, father, mother, 2 daughters, and a young boy, all seated stiffly before a velvet backdrop. The card beneath the image read, E. Marston and Cummand, Boston, at 1890. To anyone else, it was another sepia portrait from another forgotten household. But the catalogue description carried an odd note. Condition stable, though prior documentation indicates subtle variation in facial composition over time. Variation. In a photograph. When Vance brought it home, he compared the image to an older black and white print published decades earlier in a regional history booklet. The faces were the same, yet not identical. A tilt of the head that hadn't been there before. A faint outline near the window, almost like someone standing just outside the frame. Curators who later examined it found no evidence of retouching, no chemical alteration, consistent with double exposure or restoration. Still, small differences appeared each time it was rephotographed. One museum registrar finally wrote in her report, "It behaves like a photograph that refuses to stay still." Local historians traced the Whitlocks, the family in the portrait, to New Haven, Connecticut. Their census entries end abruptly in 1892 after a house fire destroyed most of the property. The photograph somehow survived. By all logic, a picture is supposed to hold time still, to preserve what memory cannot. Yet here was an image that seemed to defy stillness, changing not with damage or decay, but with observation itself. And so the question formed, one that has followed this photograph through every hand that's held it since. If a photograph exists to remember us, what happens when the photograph begins remembering more than we do? By the 1890s, photography had evolved from a technical curiosity into a cultural ritual. The wet plate collodion process, once cumbersome and chemical heavy, had given way to the more forgiving dry plate method. Portrait studios dotted small American towns, their glass windows reflecting not just faces, but aspirations of permanence, of remembrance, of control over time itself. To sit for a photograph in that era was an act of faith, a belief that light and chemistry could preserve the soul long after the flesh had vanished. Among the families who embraced this faith were the Whitlocks of New Haven, Connecticut, a modest middle-class household recorded in the 1890 and 1900 census. Thomas Whitlock, a factory foreman, lived with his wife Eleanor and their 2 children, Clara and James. The surviving records describe them as church-going and respectable, the kind of family whose Sunday portraits were meant for mantel display, framed in ornate walnut, standing against the quiet dignity of the era's domestic life. But history does not always preserve peace. In the winter of 1892, tragedy struck. A fire tore through the Whitlock home, consuming nearly everything. Neighbors recalled the sky burning orange over Chapel Street, and the local paper reported only one item surviving the flames, a single family photograph, retrieved by a volunteer firefighter from the ruins of the parlor. It was this image, later found in the family estate inventory, that would begin its strange journey. After Eleanor's death in 1903, the photograph passed through relatives before eventually entering the holdings of a small Massachusetts museum. In 1979, the museum quietly sold several private pieces to fund expansion, the Whitlock portrait among them. The buyer, an anonymous collector, would later claim the image shifted over the years, faint differences in the children's eyes, the tilt of the mother's head, shadows that seemed to migrate between glass and paper. Early explanations came quickly: chemical degradation, moisture exposure, uneven emulsion. Yet none matched the oddly deliberate pattern of change. No scientific test, even under ultraviolet and infrared analysis, has ever confirmed tampering or deterioration. And so the question remains. Could a photograph, a mechanical witness meant to freeze one moment in time, also record what time forgot? In the silvered depths of that image, between shadow and memory, lies the haunting possibility that the Whitlocks never truly left their frame. The first professional restoration of the Whitlock photograph took place in 1981. Decades of exposure had yellowed the edges and dulled the emulsion, prompting its private owner to consult a conservator, Margaret Denning at the Boston Photographic Archive. Denning was known for her precision, a restorer who treated every image as both artifact and testimony. When she lifted the fragile glass plate under cold light, she expected the usual: mildew, oxidation, the faint shimmer of time's corrosion. What she saw instead unsettled her. Behind the Whitlock family, behind their carefully posed figures, she noticed what looked like faint human outlines. Not scratches, not stains, but the soft, almost symmetrical suggestion of two silhouettes. They were positioned as if standing at the back of the parlor, in the blurred depth where the wallpaper faded into shadow. When she magnified the section under a stereo microscope, the figures appeared to have form, one taller, one smaller, as though an adult and child had been present unseen. When the original plate was exposed, Denning documented her findings in the restoration notes, describing residual shapes inconsistent with 1890s double exposure and layer density suggesting secondary image interference. The plate was resealed and stored, but her report circulated quietly among photographic historians. One researcher compared the restoration images to a microfilm record from 1920, preserved in the Connecticut Historical Society. There, a curious anomaly appeared: the same family photograph, but the background curtain that had hung half open in the 1890 print was now fully drawn. Was it an altered copy? A later print from a retouched negative? None of the technical analyses supported that explanation. The curtain, furniture shadows, and even the glint of light on Eleanor Whitlock's brooch had subtly shifted, as if the room itself, not the paper, had changed. By 1983, Dr. Elise Harland, a photography historian at Yale, became involved. Her expertise lay in 19th century emulsion chemistry, and she approached the Whitlock image with scientific detachment. Using spectrographic scanning, Harland compared the silver nitrate density to reference samples from 1885 through 1900. What she found defied historical consistency. The nitrate crystals in the image's lower half showed traces of a later compound introduced commercially around 1912. In simpler terms, the photograph contained two emulsions, one original, one added decades after the exposure. No known restoration or retouching method of the early 20th century could have produced that layering. "It's as if someone redeveloped the image from within," she wrote in her personal field log. But her fascination soon crossed into fixation. Colleagues noted that she began speaking of the Whitlocks as though they were living subjects rather than historic figures. She described their expressions as fluid, their presence as responsive. In later interviews, Harland admitted she started dreaming of the Whitlock home nightly, seeing the same parlor, the same ashen wallpaper, the faint glow of a smoldering fire beyond the frame. Her research deepened, but her tone grew increasingly personal. In one letter dated February 1984, she confessed, "Every time I study the plate, I feel as though something studies me in return." The Whitlock photograph had ceased to be a relic. It was now an active participant in its own rediscovery, reshaping not only its surface, but the minds that sought to decode it. The anomalies were no longer confined to chemistry or optics. They had begun to bleed into psychology. For those who touched the glass, the boundary between analysis and obsession blurred, and the question darkened. Was the photograph evolving, or were those who examined it being rewritten by its memory? By late 1985, Dr. Elise Harland's inquiry had moved beyond chemistry. The photograph's physical irregularities were no longer enough. She needed to understand its story, its human origins. Through a contact at the Connecticut Historical Society, her team was granted limited access to boxes of Whitlock family papers recently donated by a descendant. Inside were brittle letters, ledger pages, and household inventories dating between 1887 and 1891. Among them, one note caught Harland's attention, dated March 4, 1890, and addressed from Sarah Whitlock to her sister Margaret. The letter read in part, "We had our likeness taken again, though the children would not stay still. The picture is most peculiar. Elias says it changes with the weather. I do not see it so, but he insists the room grows darker in it when the skies do." It was a small, almost domestic remark, but its phrasing, "changes with the weather," mirrored what Harland herself had witnessed under controlled laboratory conditions nearly a century later. When humidity shifted in the archive room, so did the tonal contrast of the plate. Weeks later, a research assistant unearthed an obscure clipping from the Hartford Courant, dated June 1892. The article described a parlor exhibition in New Haven and mentioned almost mockingly a local curiosity. Guests at the Whitlock home report the strange illusion of a family portrait that seems to breathe, the eyes of its figures deepening as the lamps burn low. The story, printed just weeks before the Whitlock residence burned to the ground, gave a name to the growing myth, the breathing photograph. Harlan's curiosity deepened into a historical pursuit. She authorized a series of ultraviolet scans at the Massachusetts Photographic Laboratory, hoping to separate surface damage from hidden layers of exposure. Under UV light, new forms emerged, faint concentric patterns behind the figures' faces, like the ghost of a second exposure. The outlines were too deliberate to be chemical error. An additional emulsion had been applied, perhaps decades after the original 1890 print. But who and why? In early 1986, a research breakthrough arrived from an unlikely source. A local historian, Edwin Locke, contacted Harlan after hearing a radio segment about her work. Locke had been cataloging the estate records of E. Marston & Co., the same Boston studio whose name appeared on the Whitlock photograph. Among the papers was a partial diary belonging to Marston's assistant, Henry Coyle, dated between 1888 and 1891. The entries were brief, clinical, but revealing. Coyle's notes mentioned experimental sessions conducted after hours, tests with vapor plates and subject breath retention during fixation. One entry, dated November 17, 1890, read, "Mr. Marston believes the final exhale retains some trace of self. That breath may impress the emulsion if sealed swiftly." In another, he described what sounded like an improvised séance of science. He asked the sitter to speak one word as the plate was fixed, to let their warmth settle into the image before it cooled. Coyle referred to these as memory plates, claiming they captured not only form but feeling. No other surviving records of such techniques exist in photographic literature. Yet the Whitlock portrait's layered composition, the dual emulsions, the spectral tonal shifts suddenly aligned with this forgotten method. Harlan's lab results confirmed trace organic residues embedded within the lower emulsion, compounds consistent with human respiration, trace ammonia, microcrystalline salt, and faint carbon deposits. None of these belonged in standard photographic mixtures. The discovery blurred the boundary between science and ritual, between exposure and essence. As she pieced the fragments together, a deeper pattern began to emerge. Harlan cross-referenced archival photographs of the Whitlock family, taken across decades. In each surviving image, whether reprinted, rephotographed, or preserved in microfilm, the visual alterations coincided with family tragedies. In 1892, the house fire that killed two of the Whitlock children. The curtain closed in the image. In 1918, influenza took the eldest son. The window's light dimmed. In 1936, a descendant's drowning corresponded with the appearance of a faint water stain that no restorer could remove. It was as though the photograph absorbed each loss, encoding grief into chemistry. The idea was impossible, yet the evidence accumulated with unnerving precision. By 1993, after nearly a decade of study, Harlan presented her findings at the annual Society for Historical Photography Symposium in Baltimore. Her paper, titled "The Persistence of Exposure: Temporal Anomalies in Collodion Imagery," was met with polite skepticism. Attendees questioned her methodology, some dismissing the diary as romantic fabrication, others suggesting environmental contamination. During the closing session, the Whitlock image, projected onto a large screen from a high-resolution scan, seemed to some witnesses inexplicably altered. Several attendees later wrote privately to Harlan, claiming the curtain behind the family appeared half open, though the official projection file showed it fully drawn. The discrepancies were small, subjective, the kind skeptics could easily dismiss. But to those who had seen the original print, the sense of movement was unmistakable. Something within the image was active, elusive, resisting permanence. Harlan's work was never formally published. She returned to Yale quietly, her research sealed in institutional archives. Yet among the few who had seen the Whitlock photograph firsthand, the feeling persisted that the image was not simply changing, but remembering. 2 decades after Dr. Elise Harlan's controversial symposium, the Whitlock photograph had settled into quiet obscurity. It remained sealed in controlled storage at the Massachusetts Historical Archive, catalogued, indexed, and for most forgotten. But in 2005, a team of conservators revisiting early photographic collections for digital preservation requested to rescan the Whitlock plate. What began as a routine archival procedure would become the most unsettling revelation in the photograph's history. The high-resolution scan, produced using a 2400 dpi spectral imager, revealed something no one had ever noticed on the glass negative itself: the faint, whirled ridges of human fingerprints pressed directly into the emulsion layer, not surface oil, not contamination. The ridges were embedded, part of the hardened photographic matrix. When magnified under polarized light, the patterns were clear and complete enough for forensic analysis. Out of curiosity, one technician submitted them to a state database for anonymous comparison. The results, returned 3 weeks later, made no rational sense. The partial prints matched 2 individuals, Marjorie and Daniel Whitlock, living descendants of the same family, both born in the 1950s, more than 60 years after the emulsion had dried. The finding caused immediate confusion within the lab. Chain of custody logs were verified, contamination protocols reviewed, and the emulsion cross-sectioned under SEM microscopy. Yet the depth of the ridge impressions proved they had formed at the time of exposure, not after. To alter a glass plate's emulsion later would require heat and solvents that would destroy the image entirely. When confronted with the data, Marjorie Whitlock, then 60 years old, offered a quiet response during an interview. She didn't deny the prints could be hers. She simply said, "I've dreamed of that picture all my life. The room behind the curtain, the faces I can't quite name." Her statement prompted further inquiry. Family members confirmed that Marjorie often spoke in her sleep, describing the parlor with the heavy drape, though she had never seen the original photograph until the day of her interview. Old stories within the Whitlock family spoke of the picture that watches back, an heirloom believed to bring misfortune if displayed too long. A production crew filming a short local documentary about the phenomenon arranged to capture the plate under controlled lighting. During one test, as the cinematographer adjusted the light angle, a shadow on the glass shifted, not as a reflection, but independently against the static background. The movement was brief, subtle, yet captured clearly on film. The room fell silent. Every crew member felt the same thing. Not fear exactly, but presence. Forensic analysts reviewed the footage, suggesting thermal fluctuation or refractive illusion. But the temperature remained stable throughout the recording. No logical explanation sufficed. The phenomenon, movement within the immovable, was now recorded by modern equipment. Psychologists began to take interest, particularly Dr. Adrian Keller from the University of Vermont, who specialized in the psychology of memory imprinting. Keller proposed an unsettling hypothesis, that memory is not a fixed property of the mind, but an interactive process, capable under rare conditions of externalizing fragments of consciousness onto the objects we repeatedly associate with emotional memory. Keller cited historical experiments with observer effect in neuropsychology, instances where prolonged exposure to emotionally charged stimuli caused subjects to project internal imagery onto ambiguous visuals. The Whitlock photograph, he argued, isn't changing by itself. It's changing because we remember it differently each time we see it, and somehow the medium is responding. This theory found unexpected support in Harlan's earlier data. The image alterations had always coincided with moments of heightened emotional focus: the deaths, the fires, the dreams. Each generation of Whitlocks had revisited the portrait, stared at it, mourned before it. Perhaps through repetition, their collective memory had become part of its chemistry. A second scan of the photograph was conducted 6 months later. Same lighting, same calibration. And yet, the curtain behind the family appeared partially open once more, revealing a sliver of space that hadn't been visible before, the suggestion of a doorway. Faint but unmistakable. When compared with older prints, the new detail aligned precisely with descriptions Marjorie had given in interviews of the room behind the curtain. What made the revelation most haunting was its implication. The photograph wasn't autonomous. It was reactive, a mirror not of reality but of remembrance. Each observer left an invisible fingerprint of their memory upon it, subtly rewriting what the plate revealed. By late 2005, Keller summarized his findings in an unpublished paper. If photographs are memory-made material, perhaps memory, in turn, is a photograph still developing. But the question that haunted every researcher, every descendant, every technician who handled the plate remained unresolved. If the Whitlock photograph changes according to who remembers it, then whose memory does it hold now? The image, under its sealed glass casing, reflects only the viewer, and sometimes observers claim the reflection blinks. By 2011, the Whitlock photograph had become more legend than artifact, a curiosity whispered about in restoration circles and referenced in late-night university lectures. Most academics had moved on, but Dr. Elise Harland, now in her 60s, could not. What began as her doctoral curiosity had matured into something closer to an unfinished conversation. That winter, she returned to New Haven, to the original site of the Whitlock residence on Chapel Street, where the fire of 1892 had first rewritten the family's story. The neighborhood was different now, asphalt layered over memory. But beneath a vacant lot, local records still marked the coordinates of the house's foundation. With permission from the city's preservation office, Harland and two graduate researchers conducted a small excavation. What they found amid layers of soil and ash was a rusted tin box, warped from heat but still sealed. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating linen, were 4 glass negatives, charred at the edges, but miraculously intact in their centers. When cleaned and stabilized, the plates revealed fragments of early portrait attempts, blurred faces, half exposures, and on the final negative, an image unmistakably related to the Whitlock family photograph. Only this one was different. The same parlor, the same arrangement, the same clothing, but one figure was missing. The father, Thomas Whitlock, was absent. In his place stood a faint, translucent outline, as though the exposure had never quite captured him. Forensic testing confirmed what seemed impossible. Both negatives bore the same plate number, etched faintly in the emulsion corner, a unique identifier used by E. Marston & Co., the Boston studio that produced the original. Spectral dating revealed one negative predated the other by roughly 3 weeks. This finding defied ordinary studio practice. Why would a photographer produce 2 exposures on the same plate within such a short interval? The answer came again from Marston's recovered assistant diary, the same one Harland had studied decades earlier. One obscure line stood out now with chilling clarity. He believes the double plate may capture what remains, if the breath has not yet cooled. The implication was disturbing. Marston had been experimenting with what he called memory plates, attempting to use a subject's final breath during fixation to preserve not only likeness, but essence. The Whitlock's first sitting may have occurred weeks before the father's death, the second perhaps after. When the 2 negatives were scanned and digitally combined, Harland noticed something extraordinary. The overlapping emulsion layers revealed new coherence, the blurred background sharpened, shadows aligned. In the composite, the Whitlock family appeared subtly different, their eyes not fixed toward the distance as before, but toward the viewer, as if newly aware of being seen. The image was printed once under controlled lab conditions. Every technician present reported the same sensation, that of being regarded. One archivist later said, "It wasn't frightening. It was recognition, like something had finally completed itself." In 2012, the combined image was displayed publicly at the Hartford Museum of History under the exhibition title Memory in Silver. The show drew modest crowds but heavy media attention. Critics described it as a bridge between technology and the metaphysical, while skeptics accused the museum of theatrics. Yet the event logs tell their own story. Over 3 nights, electronic systems in the gallery repeatedly malfunctioned. Security feeds glitched, light sensors flickered, and temperature controls fluctuated without identifiable cause. Engineers attributed it to electromagnetic interference from nearby construction. Still, none of the other exhibits were affected. Visitors described subtle phenomena. The photograph's frame humming faintly, reflections shifting even as they stood still. One woman swore she saw the curtain in the background ripple slightly, as if touched by a passing breeze. Through it all, Harland remained composed. When interviewed for a local newspaper, she dismissed supernatural claims but admitted to something deeper. "If the photograph changed," she said, "it's because we changed. Memory is never static. Perhaps it needed us to finish remembering." Months after the exhibition closed, Harland wrote her final paper on the case. It ended not with conclusion but with acceptance. A photograph does not merely preserve, it participates. The Whitlock image has done what memory cannot. It has endured intact, even as meaning shifts around it. In that endurance lies its truth. Today, the restored composite rests in the museum's temperature-controlled archive, sealed behind non-reflective glass. It no longer alters, or perhaps no one dares look long enough to find out. And yet, standing before it, one cannot escape the feeling that it has fulfilled its purpose, that in holding the gaze of generations, it remembered what no one else could. In the years that followed the exhibition, the Boyle photograph refused to fade quietly into history. It began to circulate in niche online forums devoted to paranormal archives and antique photography. Users debated its authenticity, posting pixel-by-pixel analyses of the shadowed background, insisting they could see movement that hadn't been there before. What started as a museum curiosity became a digital cult artifact, dissected, re-uploaded, and mythologized across threads with titles like "The Photo That Watches Back" and "Proof of Residual Presence." By 2012, academics began citing it in papers on what they termed technological haunting, a phenomenon suggesting that machines, too, could inherit emotional residue. Cameras, phonographs, even early X-ray machines each carried the potential to trap not only light or sound, but something else entirely: intention, grief, obsession. The Boyle photograph, they said, wasn't haunted because of who it depicted, but because of how it was made. It embodied the intersection of human longing and mechanical precision, the moment art and technology first conspired to freeze the soul. Skeptics, of course, were never far behind. They argued that the stories had simply evolved through collective memory, that the ghostly shifting of the image was a trick of resolution, degradation, or projection bias. Yet even the skeptics could not ignore the cultural persistence of the photograph. Why, they asked, did one Victorian portrait continue to evoke unease in an age saturated with manipulated imagery? The Massachusetts Museum of Photography released several statements attempting to neutralize speculation, claiming the image had not changed in any measurable or scientific way. But privately, a few staff members admitted that the photograph had been quietly removed from display in 2016. Today, it resides in a temperature-controlled vault at the Massachusetts Historical Image Archive, catalogued but unseen. Visitors can request access only through special clearance, and even then the photograph is presented behind layered glass, its reflection visible before the image itself. The curators claim it's for preservation, to protect the fragile surface from humidity and exposure, but those who've seen it whisper that the portrait no longer appears exactly as it once did. The figure's posture, they say, has grown ever so slightly upright, as if aware of being observed once more. As for Dr. Harland, she retired quietly in 2018, never releasing her final notes on the photograph's restoration. Colleagues later discovered an unmarked envelope in her desk containing what appeared to be a duplicate of the Boyle portrait, except no one remembered taking a new exposure. The version in the envelope seemed different. The eyes were softer, the background dimmer. Some claim it was a trick of light. Others say it was the final proof of the photograph's evolution. Perhaps the image never changed at all. Perhaps it is we, the viewers, the witnesses, who do. Each generation brings new fears to the same still frame, reading our own reflections into its silvered glass. In that sense, the Boyle photograph endures not as a haunting, but as a mirror, one that remembers us as much as we remember it. Memory, like light, never truly disappears. It bends, refracts, and reshapes itself through those who remember. A photograph, then, is not a frozen thing. It breathes in silence, changing subtly with every glance cast upon it. Each viewer alters it, however imperceptibly, adding new layers of meaning that no camera could ever capture. We imagine memory as something fragile, something that fades. Yet what if forgetting is not decay but transformation, a way for the mind to make room for what the image cannot release? The Boyle photograph remains unwavering, even as generations drift further from the moment it was taken. The more we forget the people in its frame, the more vividly the image seems to recall them. Artifacts, too, have a kind of hunger. They absorb fragments of us, our breath, our fear, our fascination, and carry those traces forward long after we're gone. Perhaps the real curse of photography was never its ability to freeze time, but its power to give time somewhere else to live, and so, beneath the quiet hum of the archive, one photograph still waits, unchanging, yet alive. In that single image from 1890, time is still watching,